Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, as-salatu was-salam nabi kareem Muhammad wa ali tayyibin wa sahbi salihin, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to thank the organizers and the Manitoba Islamic Association for inviting me here to, was it Dead Center Canada, right? Is this right, roughly in the center, more or less? Right? So I feel at the heart of Canada. It's interesting to see this kind of place in the midst of winter. Well, it's now coming to spring now, isn't it? So, but there's still snow and it's kind of cold and quite interesting. One of the brothers said to me like 2 days ago it was minus 30 or 40. I don't know. So I was like, oh, I missed it. But khair, inshallah. I was told that coming into Canada there were so many COVID restrictions that you'd have to take like 5 swabs just to get off the plane or something. I don't know. But khair, inshallah, I managed to somehow, my fellow speakers were kind of tested quite a bit, were randomly selected for testing. But for some reason, I slipped through, which is quite a feat considering how big I am. They must have not noticed me, I don't know how. So I'm not complaining. One of the smoothest entries to Canada. So far, despite all these COVID tests. But anyway, subhanAllah, first event in Canada after the COVID restrictions are kind of relaxing. But ever since they got implemented, unfortunately last year I wasn't able to come in person to Canada. So I was quite missing Tim Hortons. I was having Tim Hortons withdrawal. So alhamdulillah, I get my new dosage this time. Okay, so today's topic is about a house on fire, and it's about how to put out a fire using a water pump. No, not joking, no. It's about fighting the fires created by quote-unquote modernity that the Muslim community faces. And we're going to have some, let's say, very frank discussions, sometimes a little bit controversial, but not controversial to anyone who's reasonable, I suppose, but we have to discuss things that most people might not want to discuss out in the open, especially Muslims, yeah? Oh, they're up. Where? Oh, excellent. How do I control them? With the power of my mind? No, okay, I'll just say next slide. Jazakallah. Oh, alhamdulillah, excellent. All right, great. So, how can we fight the conflicts of modernity? How do we kind of create peace and unity? And everyone talks about unity as, oh, we wish unity. Some people like world peace, they want world unity. But what does that mean? Everyone likes to talk about unity until it comes time to actually doing it. Or until it comes to paying the cost of actually, practically unifying. Oh, no one wants to do that. Oh, no. But we like talking about it. And so we have to talk about being serious about what it means to be unified and how to eliminate conflicts in the Muslim community and inshallah globally. So let's kind of go to our next slide. Let's talk about just some sources of conflict, just a few. So in the Muslim community, although generally in almost every religion, but in the Muslim community we have a problem of sectarianism, kind of being divided into firaq, right? Different factions. And now you might think, is this because we just have difference of opinion, right? Is difference of opinion sufficient to make someone a firq, a faction? No, it's your mentality about how you approach difference of opinion that makes you a faction or not, right? Because we know that there's many ahadith where the Rasulullah ﷺ commands the Muslims to stick to the jama'ah and their imam, the imam of the jama'ah. Now, the imam of the jama'ah is the khalifa of the Muslims, the Amir al-Mu'mineen, but we don't have one. So then what remains of the jama'ah? Right, what jama'ah are we meant to hold to? Well, in the times since the Rasulullah ﷺ onwards, the jama'ah was the main body of Muslims, the main political unit where Muslim power was concentrated, actually politically concentrated, the actual jama'ah. But that has been split into, well, forget the 73 different sects. We're talking about 40, 45 plus Muslim countries. And each one would be classified as a firq because they are separate. There's borders, separate nationalities, or rather nation states. separate political jurisdictions, and each one doing its own thing, and sometimes doing things against each other, that's not really unity when we're meant to only have one imam. But not one imam like, oh, what, you mean Abu Hanifa, or, Malik or Shafi? Well, no, they were never political imams, right? Imams as in one imam, one political leader over the Muslims, right? That unifies us. What other interpretation of be not divided amongst yourselves in the Quran can you come about with? If you're saying, well, that means we all agree on the same opinions, well, the Sahaba had ikhtilaf between themselves. Abu Bakr and Umar had ikhtilaf on interpreting what whether divorce is one pronouncement or three pronouncements in one sitting, in one sitting. They had ikhtilaf on something like this amongst the Sahaba. So how are you gonna all have the same? Assalamu alaikum. He wants to see what's behind here. Yeah, nothing much, just a mihrab. So you can't really expect Muslims to have the same opinion, but that's not what it's meant by unity. That's not the point of unity. The point of unity is actual, real political unity, i.e., we see our interests as one collectively. So if Muslims are getting hurt in somewhere in the world, the rest of the ummah responds with like fever and sleeplessness, as the hadith says, how the ummah is one body. Right? So that the interest of the Muslims currently suffering in India under oppression by Hindutva fascists is our people, us, our community is suffering. How do we approach that as one ummah? It's not, oh, that's just for Indian Muslims or Indians. Well, they're not just, we don't view them as Indian citizens per se. From our lens, we view them as our brothers and sisters, part of our own family, is being oppressed. So it's even more than just fellow citizens. A fellow citizen is not a family member, right? A fellow citizen is just someone who has a similar passport to you. But ummah, which comes from the root word mother, is a family term, a familial term. Muslims you can't even necessarily view us necessarily as one qawm, but rather we're closer than that, right? We actually are our family, more than just the cousins of Bani Adam, that we're all biologically cousins, but we're closer than that, right? That's one thing, but so we're going to discuss sectarianism. Then we're going to discuss nationalism, which is one of the major causes of division in the Muslim world and throughout the world. Generally, why is Ukraine being invaded by Russia? It's due to nationalism. All comes from nationalism. On both sides, there were causes which were connected to nationalism that led to the fight. Right? So nationalism is the biggest, one of the biggest causes of warfare today in the modern world. People talk about religion causing wars. So when was the last war that you remember was actually caused by religion? Right? Many centuries ago. But if you want to count how many wars are caused by nationalism, which is meant to be part of modernity, well, you're going to need a couple of pages to write down the list. Yeah, it's ongoing. Liberalism. Now, liberalism is a political philosophy. We'll discuss what it actually means in detail rather than just the word liberalism. I'm going to disambiguate it for you. But liberalism is the ideology that is touted to be how human beings should be organized politically and what rights and under what kind of laws that they should be organized under. And many Muslims who come to the West and they think, well, the West is technologically currently superior to the Muslim world anyway. All the non-Western countries are even beginning now to surpass the West, technologically speaking, in their developments like China and other such places. But we see that Muslims think that the West is advanced because of its ideology, its current ideology of liberalism. When anyone can tell you that if you look at history, the West started to technologically advance from the 12th century after encountering Muslim works of technology and writings, and they were advancing for at least 600 years before liberalism was even implemented. So they went from medieval age to Renaissance to inventing the steam engine, and then liberalism was invented. So is liberalism connected to the technological development? No. But because they are currently the leading political and military civilization in the world, many Muslims have done what previous people who've been conquered do. They imitate the conquerors, and they think the conquerors are better. And if you think that this is a brand new phenomenon only happened to Muslims, no. Much of Jewish thinking under Roman occupation, and before that under after Alexander the Great conquered the area, many Jewish thinkers became Hellenized, i.e. let's say Greek. They wanted to look at Greek thinking and adopt Greek philosophy because that was what they thought was the dominant civilization, and the philosophy of civilized people was Roman and Greek thought, and a lot of their thinkings got changed. Christianity emerged from the imitation of Greco-Roman thinking. So you obviously had Isa alayhi salam's teachings, which was still within the scope of, you could say, Judaism, although he's a new prophet, but he didn't abrogate the laws of Moses, generally speaking. Still following the laws of Moses, generally speaking. And then you had these people come who were giving da'wah to Gentiles, to non-Jews, and they said, why do we have to tell the non-Jews to follow, like Jewish law? And it's hard to get someone to convert to this, let's just call it, they didn't call it Christianity at that time, but to convert to the teachings of Jesus when they have to get circumcised. What Greek or Roman is ever going to accept that, right? So they began to change their laws and even tried to claim that their new teachings were basically were saying the same thing as Greco-Roman philosophy. Right? For example, to a Greek and a Roman, if you come up to them and say, look, this guy called Isa alayhi salam, or Jesus, he's like really amazing, he's a prophet of God, he's a messenger. But these guys believe that anyone who's anyone, a great man becomes a god. Like Hercules becomes, was half god or godlike, but Pythagoras, there's a cult about him and he was deemed to become a god. For those who don't understand how that is, it is a bit weird for pagan thinking, but even in modern day Hindu culture, a great hero in the past, or a great hero even with modern times, they say they become a god, right? Like that. It's like that thinking of how it is. So when these Christians come giving da'wah to Christianity, and the Romans say, okay, well, who's this guy, Jesus? And they say, oh, he's a prophet, he's a messenger of God, he did miracles. It's like, well, yeah, so what? We've got, our emperor is like son of Jupiter. That's like, if you're going to be someone, you have to be son of a god or God himself, or a god, right? So unfortunately, many Christians wanting to impress, their da'wah wanting to impress the Greeks and Romans, they changed their religion to say, well, in a way, Jesus is kind of like, a god, right? And that is how it changed. And that's how all the things that you hear from Christians that you just don't see in Judaism and you don't see in Islam. It's like, where'd you get this from? Doesn't sound Abrahamic. It's from the Greeks and Romans, as the Christians tried to match their da'wah to the culture of this superior civilization to make it enticing, saying, oh, we're just like you, but we've got Jesus and he's kind of teaching the teaching that you are part of your culture. So why don't you embrace Christianity because it's not different, right? Now, what do you get some Muslims today saying and doing in the West, right? They say, oh yeah, the Prophet Muhammad, he had liberal teachings 1400 years ago. He was teaching liberalism, he was teaching equality, absolute equality of gender roles between the sexes. What, really? That's not. And of course, this then leads to many Muslims getting doubts about Islam, because when they actually open up the Quran and the hadith, they don't see the liberal teachings that they were taught or told makes Islam special. Even though, and how is Islam special if it's just like the current culture of the countries that you're living in? And then many of them say, well, what's the point? I heard one Muslim say, what's the point of Islam if it just says the same thing? It's just to say, follow whatever everyone else is following during their age or their time. Isn't that what people do naturally anyway? They follow whatever they're following, what is the majority culture in their time, or the most powerful culture in their time. So just following your time isn't saying anything. So the Quran came as a reminder to tell you just to follow what everyone is following in their time? Kind of ridiculous, right? But because of this, many Muslims, their call to Islam is based on false premises. And many of them leave Islam because they thought Islam was liberal. Because when giving da'wah to a non-Muslim is liberal, many Muslims try, well, how do I impress them? I have to say, well, Islam has these liberal values in it, it's just like you guys. When what we should be saying is, why is liberalism right? How is it justifiable? Where'd you get that idea from? Well, we're going to go through that very, very quickly as well. Then feminism, people sometimes refer to it as an ideology, but feminism is more like a something you append to liberalism, something that comes with liberalism. When liberalism was basically, let's say, being implemented, it was put for men first, and then feminism is just like, oh, liberalism for women as well, please. That's basically what it is. And many Muslims, unfortunately, have thought that the best way to, just like the best way they thought was to call to Islam by saying it was liberal, they say we're going to call to Islam by saying it's also feminist as well, right? Or they see unfortunately, the non-Islamic practices in the Muslim community and non-Islamic mindsets, which sometimes or many times does affect marriages, where the husband or both parties are not really using Islam as a basis for their marriage to understand how to live with each other, and the failures of Muslims to implement Islam or even understand it properly within the marital context spur many to say we need feminism to rectify these problems, even though feminism doesn't really concern itself with the mutual rights in a marriage, but only with the rights of one party. And how are you going to bring balance to a marriage if you're only going to focus on what one side wants and not the other, even though it's meant to be symbiotic, like mutual? And last but not least, woke culture was post-Marxism, but what is currently called woke culture or social justice activism, which I hear is quite strong in Canada in many parts, but also is strong in the United States of America amongst left-wing movements and parties. Most people don't realize that the woke culture, or post-Marxist as they're called, because they came from the Marxist tradition, although they're technically not Marxist anymore, something that Jordan Peterson discovered when he tried to debate Slavoj Žižek, and he read Karl Marx's kind of manifesto and all the literature to refute Slavoj Žižek, who says he's a Marxist. And Slavoj Žižek said, like, yeah, I don't care if basically he doesn't care if you refute Marx because they've moved on. They've moved beyond Marx. That's why it's called post-Marxism, right? And so Jordan Peterson was basically just got a shock because he just realized all his preparation was for nothing, and he actually didn't understand Slavoj Žižek coming into that debate. And then Slavoj Žižek gave him a bit of an education as to his more nuanced beliefs and ideas. Why is it important? Well, because post-Marxism still is a critique of liberalism, includes a critique of liberalism. And many Muslims think, oh, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. No, the enemy of your enemy sometimes can be your enemy as well, sometimes even a worse enemy. Right? Something more antithetical to Islam, the ideals of post-Marxism. So we're going to go through that very quickly, inshallah. Okay, next slide, please, brother. Right. So sectarianism. The Muslim world faces a problem of sectarianism. It usually occurs where people say they do takfir of each other based on differing theological opinions on parts of Islam which are not qati dalala, and also based on text, which is not qati dhubut. So clear-cut text and clear-cut authority. The text is a clear-cut authority, like the Quran. You can't dispute a verse in the Quran whether you should believe in it or not, because it's in the Quran as a Muslim. If you don't, you're no longer a Muslim. You can't dispute mutawatir narrations, which we'll get to what they are, as in you can't reject them because they're clear-cut, but in terms of their authority. But you can have ikhtilaf, and technically you can reject without theological implications ahad narrations, which we'll get into, but you have to have good reason to, but we'll discuss that. So, but sometimes there's also takfir light, which is to call someone a mubtadi' or a deviant or a heretic, to use that Christian term, which is like takfir light. Like you're not expelling them from Islam exactly, but you're saying that they've deviated from the correct way. But here's the issue, and I do understand that this was what some of the classical scholars, they did use the term, like deviation against others. But also many classical scholars who are all Sunni, used to takfir each other. Most people don't realize that. There was takfir between the Asha'ira and those who follow the Athari school of thought. There was takfir even between Hanafis and Shafis at one point. Muslims in the past, unfortunately, had periods where takfir got out of control, and of course then Imam Ghazali comes on and says we need to like put a break on this, and at least try to sort out when you can takfir and when you can't takfir, and you need to have clear guidelines. Otherwise, it's just a mutual takfir fest, right? What are the moral implications? Well, the moral implications is that Muslims will exclude each other in their communities, saying that this person is not Muslim, or this person is a deviant or a heretic or what have you, and they will then do bara against them. They will kind of exclude themselves from them. And the theological implications, of course, is that Islam no longer becomes something that is meant to be based on the Quran and what is clear-cut in the Sunnah, but becomes relocated to being based on what an arbitrary selected group of scholars say, and all other scholars are ignored. And so whenever you speak to someone, they say there's an ijma of the scholars, of the imma on this issue. They say, no, there's an ijma of a select group of scholars that you like or you want to follow. But there are other groups of scholars which are just as learned around the world in many different countries, which disagree. Okay? And that's not how Muslims should be arguing. Muslims should be arguing, saying, convince me from the Quran and Sunnah why I should accept this particular argument and not that particular argument. You're not a scholar. Fine, I'm not going to do ijtihad. But you need to still convince me, giving me the dalil and showing me. Like, what's the point of scholars if they don't tell you, explain to you a hukum? They have to explain it to you, right? If they don't, then, and you just follow them blindly with no question, then what have you done with that scholar? You've made them like a Rabb to you. Because the only one you don't question is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even the Sahabas would ask the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, why did you say this? Or before the Battle of Badr, the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted to put a military camp somewhere, and one of the Sahabas said, is this revelation to you, or is this an opinion of war and tactics? And so he said, it's an opinion of war and tactics. Then he said, well, can I suggest to you, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that you put it the military camp more in a defensible area? So they asked, why did you say that? But yet we have to say to scholars, or any particular scholar, individual cited, he's a scholar, he knows better than you, so be quiet and just accept what he says. Right? No, excuse me, at least show me his working out. Right? I need to see where he got that from. Right? So sure, I would never be able to do it myself because I'm not a scholar, but just show me his working out. Right? He can explain it to us. That's the point what experts do. They're meant to be teaching the ummah how to understand Islam better. Right? But there are also political implications of sectarianism. Now, unlike the West, which used to have wars of religion between the Catholics and the Protestants, and Protestants between themselves, the Muslim world has never had, with a few exceptions, wars which were generated by actual ikhtilaf, Islamic ikhtilaf. Apart from the Khawarij and the Safavid takeover of Persia, which persecuted many people who were from who identify with the Ahl Sunnah. There hasn't been specific wars that were motivated by madhab. Even the Ottoman and Safavid wars that came later on were not specifically by madhab, because the Ottomans had Shia amongst them, and they never destroyed the Shia shrines or what have you. That sometimes the Shia shrines were even actually maintained by the Ottomans at one point, and Ottomans were meant to be the Khilafah of the Muslims, of all the Muslims. So clearly, if it was a religious war, they would be destroying the killing Shias or force converting them, or destroying their shrines or masajid. So that didn't occur. But what does occur is you get certain regimes today who are fighting an enemy who might have a different school of thought, and they just use their state-backed scholars to motivate the people to hate the people of a different school of thought, which helps their war effort. Then people are more likely to support their war effort, right? And I'm not going to be general about this, I'm going to be very specific. Let's just, Yemen's being destroyed right now. And I've spoken to many Muslims around the world about this. And many of them say, look, yeah, it's wrong what Saudi is doing. But, we have to control the spread of Shiism. And I was like, is Yemen actually going to be, like, are Shias invading Yemen? Like, actually invading Yemen? I said, no, but there's like Iranian influence. I was like, well, no, the Houthis are basically Zaydi Shia, and they've been having that tradition for 1,400 years there, Zaydi Shia. They haven't come from anywhere recently, right? That's where they live. And when you say the spread of Shiism, in what sense? Like, is there forced conversions of Sunnis happening? Is Saudi Arabia going to somehow, does Saudi Arabia even attack and kill Shias to stop the spread of Shiism? Like, what do you mean by we need the Saudi army to stop the spread of Shias? Like, how does that work exactly? What do you mean by this? Because no one's killing each other based on their school of thought, in terms of from these states anyway. So why this mention? Well, it's because these states are using madhabs to just strengthen their case. It's a fight of influence between Iran and Saudi Arabia, true, but it's not because of madhab. It's just because Iran wants to claim the kind of the center of the axis of the Muslim world, and Saudi Arabia wants to be the axis of the Muslim world, or at least of the Arab world, or what have you. Right? Why you say, Abdullah, isn't the Iranian regime sectarian? In practice, it can be, but its official policy has always been it wants to encourage Islamic revolution around the Muslim world, and most of the Muslim world is Sunni, so it's trying to encourage it. But because of its nationalism, when there was an Islamic revolution occurring, or at least with rebels who were calling to Islam in Syria, homegrown Syrians, Iran sided with its ally, the Syrian government, against them. Whereas Iran has always been saying it's been trying to encourage Islamic revolution. Okay, well, there's some Islamic revolutionaries in Syria now arising. Not to be confused with Daesh, who are basically from Iraq. And there's a long story with where they've come from. But I'm just talking about homegrown Syrians, average Syrians saying wants Islamic law, and popular groups actually amongst Syria, well liked amongst the Syrian opposition, amongst those who were protesting against the Syrian government. But because the Syrian government is an ally of Iran, and Iran just wonders, well, should I take a risk on these new regime coming in, which we don't know what they're going to decide, even though they're meant to be Islamic? Should we rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and just stick to our principles and actually support them? Or should we just go with what we know, the Syrian regime, which has been an ally to Persia, to Iran? And they chose the latter, and that ended up them killing and supporting the killing of the revolutionaries they claimed they supported for last couple of decades. You understand? So sectarianism really needs to be dealt with, because it is the cause, it is the motivating impetus behind many of these wars. And Iran doesn't say it's trying to control Sunnism, but what Iran says is it's trying to control takfirism, right? And what Iran tries to tell its people is that it tells its people that it's basically trying. Is there an adhan going? Is it time for Isha? Oh, why is the adhan going on from some? So is it not Isha? Sorry? How many? In 15 minutes, yeah? Oh, so where the adhan's coming from then? Is it someone's phone ringtone, huh? Must be confusing every time you get a call, you have to pray. Okay. What was that? Yeah. So what Iran tells its people is that there are extremist Sunnis that want to kill all Shia, and so because of that, they should fight for whatever war the Iranian regime is involved in, because they're doing it to protect Shias, even though the people they're fighting against are in reality don't really care about Shias per se, are just fighting against the Syrian government. And the Iranian regime manipulates its people and those influences outside it to fight in those wars, even though it's not fighting to spread its madhab from its own propaganda, but it claims it's fighting to stop those who are killing Shias, right? Even though that's not really occurring in terms of Syria. The opposition don't really care about Shias, they just care about getting rid of the Assad government. So sectarianism is something that has to be dealt with. Next slide, please, brother. So let's get into it. What is the core creed? What is the basis for the core creed in Islam, for Aqidah? Well, the clear meanings of the Quran. So the Quran is qati' dhabut, which is a text which is, the authority is indisputable, can't dispute it. And where it has the muhkam verses, those which are clear-cut commandments, clear-cut kind of elucidations, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one. No Muslim's going to say they have the ikhtilaf, there could be two gods. That's impossible, right? I don't care what postmodernist interpretation they come with, you can't say there's more than one God. It's quite clear cut, right? And you can't say that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is not Khatam al-Nabi either, because he's Khatam al-Nabi described in the Quran. The seal of the prophets, no more prophets after him. And so hence anyone who does say he is outside the fold of Islam. And before you say what I know you're thinking, to the only way that certain people who try to say that there's new prophets after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they have to use mental gymnastics to get around that verse. So instead they say that a new prophet that has come is not a new prophet, but is under the same cloak or prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad. It's a weird mental gymnastics, like prophethood is like a kind of coat you can wear. And so this new guy who's meant to be a new prophet, he's not a new prophet, he's just having the same prophethood as the Prophet Muhammad, which is really confusing. I didn't know it was a cloak of some kind of a garment you can wear, right? But they have to use mental gymnastics to get around what is clear cut. And it doesn't work, of course, because it's clear cut what it says. Right? So that's the basis for your creed. There is no ikhtilaf on those things. These are very clear cut. You can't change them. You can't dispute them. The second basis is the clear meanings of mutawatir hadith, or mutawatir narrations. For those who don't know, a mutawatir narration, which comes from the root word in Arabic to mean successive, is where there is a narration with an isnad, a chain that goes all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam by muhaddith. And it's more than one. There's so many of them that it's impossible that they could have invented it. It could have been invented. So if someone was going to tell you that, if someone was to say to you, for example, let's take obviously a major event. How do you know that Pearl Harbor ever happened? Well, it's because there are so many different chains of narration that report that Pearl Harbor occurred that it's impossible that event just didn't happen. It was a big imagination because there's so many records of it for so many people that each of them never met each other and they all report roughly the same thing, both Japanese and American, narratives. It's impossible. It's impossible. Or to use a more recent example, let's say if all the video footage of 9/11 was deleted. Let's say all video footage of 9/11 got deleted. From YouTube, from VHSs back in the day, from people's cassette players or whatever that recorded it, it would still be impossible to deny because there'd be so many eyewitnesses to it, each reporting roughly the same thing, that it would be impossible to deny. So mutawatir narration, which is judged by case, is so many narrations, so many chains of narration that each are independent of each other and they each go back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that it's impossible that it was not what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. Absolutely, it's impossible. No, you can't disagree on this. Now, there's mutawatir hadith, but you can also say there's tawatur bil amal, which is the transmission of Islamic practices through actual physical practice. So Imam Malik, for example, he prayed Sadr al-Yadayn with hands by the side, not hands like this. And he did so not based on a hadith, but on the practices of the people of Medina, which he argued had been transmitted by a tawatur of amal, by practice. Right? And of course, there's no ikhtilaf on how Muslims do their salah in terms of how many rak'ah or how many sujood you do for each of the salah. There's going to be no school of thought that says, well, I think Fajr should be 4 rak'ah, four rak'ah you have to do, right? There's going to be no school of thought that says there's 2 pilau in 1 Fajr, right? That's a little in-joke about someone who claimed to be an ex-Muslim and then said, and the brother asked, okay, how many, he said, what school of thought did you belong to? Was it Palau or Biryani or some of that? And the guy said, I belong to, my parents practiced Palau or something. It's like, sorry, that was something, that was a little in-joke there. But so you can't have ikhtilaf on these things because these are mass transmitted in terms of how you, the basic skeleton structure of the salah, how you pray. So, next slide, please. So, clear and definite text is to be interpreted by the aid of certainty. Is certain, And the only thing that affects how we interpret clear text, of course, is obviously how it matches the real world. So if we see a text that talks about, for example, the sun or the water cycle or things like this, we can obviously interpret it with regards to the clear-cut meanings of this world, which is the material world, which is what we can observe in nature. So those are the kind of ways that we base our certainty on, is what we can observe in the world, because the Quran tells you, go out and observe things, like go out and observe how the camels are created. So you have to then go out and observe, and if you see how the camels are created or how they are formed, then that forms part of your knowledge. So outside knowledge, worldly knowledge, is also part of our Aqidah, but only what is absolutely certain, what you can directly observe. That also is part of it, but that's just a side point. I just want to add that there. But there is something else. There is, most ahadith narrations are ahad narrations, or khabar al-wahid as it's called, single chain narrations, or chain of narrations that have a number but less than enough on a case-by-case basis to give us certainty that we know the Prophet Muhammad for sure said those things. Now, Imam al-Shatibi, but I can give you any classical scholar, said that anything related to usul al-din has to be conclusive. And he said that dalil could be either ahad or mutawatir. If it is ahad, then it is obvious that it does not imply certainty. What that means then is that any opinion, any idea of ilm al-ghaib, your knowledge of the unseen, your understanding of the asma wa sifat, for example. So the Quran mentions in many cases, obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shaping things with his hands and things like this. What do we understand by those words? Or which ahadith from the Sahih narrations, even if they're Sahih, they're authentic, but they're single chain narrations, which one of them can give absolute certainty? Well, they can't. They're just interpretations, or the ahadith it could be likely, like we strongly believe that it's likely that this Sahih narration, which is what Sahih narration is meant to entail, is what the Prophet Muhammad most likely would have said or did say. But we don't know for absolute certain. Right? And amongst the schools of thought, the four schools of thought of Ahl Sunnah, some accept Sahih hadith, which others don't accept. So Imam Malik doesn't accept the Sahih hadith about, you pray with your arms folded, because he says that the amal of Medina is stronger. Right? Or again, Malikis don't accept that dogs are najas. Why? Because he says that it contradicts an interpretation of Quran whereby you can eat the kind of the game animals that your hunting animals capture for you. Your hunting animals what? That's what's going to be helping you hunting. It's a wolf, yeah, or if in Canada it was a husky or something like that, right? Yeah, but isn't the wolf or the dog? Isn't the dog going to be najas? How can you eat food that's been in the dog's mouth? Yeah. So Imam Malik said, then I don't accept the hadith that says the dogs are najas then. Right. I'm not here to change your mind about this. You can, I'm just trying to show you that the hadith about dogs being najas is deemed to be sahih. But Imam Malik said that because it contradicts a verse of Quran in his understanding, it's not. Right? And if you guys are wondering, what is rebuttal to Imam Malik? Well, just to be fair then and balanced, Imam Shafi would say that the verse of Quran is an exception for that one time. Yeah. So dogs are najas, but in that one time you can use the dog because it's going to be there's no way around it. The dog captures a pheasant you've shot or a chicken or what have you, and it captures it for you. Then you can just wash it or whatever, but you eat it, right? So Imam Shafi would say that's just an exception, whereas Imam Malik would say no, it shows a rule, it proves the rule. And who's right? Allahu Alam on this, yeah. But look, the rejection of Sahih Hadith occurs regularly amongst the schools of thought. If they think it contradicts a certain principle, or they think another Sahih Hadith is stronger, because Sahih Hadith can contradict each other, by the way. Why? Because we're not certain the Prophet Muhammad said any of those things. But Sahih, or if it's Hasan, or even Da'if, it's just levels of probability, according to the opinion of the Muhaddith. It's levels of probability. That's all it is. So in Islam, what you're meant to do, the policy of all Muslims is, a Sahih Hadith should be generally accepted with the proviso that you know that it could be wrong. And a Da'if Hadith doesn't have to be accepted, can be rejected, but you have to admit with the proviso, it could be right. That's the policy of how we are. It's similar to the Muslim policy towards the Bible. You're not allowed to reject anything in the Bible, any word or text, or in the Injil or the Torah, just in case it was true. But you're not allowed to believe in anything, just in case it's false. Right? So it's a similar policy, but not exactly the same. Why do I say this? Well, could you move 2 slides forward, please? Yeah. Okay. Why do I say this? Because you often see this very well-known hadith about it was narrated that the Rasulullah said, my ummah will divide into 73 sects, all of them will be in the fire except for one, and that is the Jama'ah. And then it was asked, and who are they, O Allah's Messenger? And he said, that which my companions are upon today. Right? So you've heard that narration quite a lot. Now there's actually disputes with that narration. Some people say there's another narration that says 73 sects, all of them will be in Jannah except for one, and there's an ikhtilaf on that. There's a dispute which I'm not going to go into. I'm just going to say, let's for the sake of argument accept that narration as definite, although it might not be because it might be ahad. So in that sense, how do we understand this? I actually think this gives us a basis behind which we can end a lot of the conflicts, but not the disagreements of opinions, but just the resentment and the conflict between Muslims. It's very simple. All the ikhtilaf that you see happen between the Ash'a'ira, between the Athariya, then you have the Mu'tazila and others, and the Murjiya and all these others. These emerged during the first 3 generations, by the way. When people say we should follow the first 3 generations, well, these things emerged in the Khawarij emerged in the first 3 generations, the Shia and the various sects of the Shia emerged within the first 3 generations. So just simply saying every one of the first 3 generations is ma'soom is not what any hadith tells you to believe in. In fact, the hadith from the first 3 generations actually says they're the best of generations because when they give testimony, they basically tell the truth. But afterwards, people will give false testimony in court, or they'll come to give testimony when no one asked them to, right? It's related to testimonies in court, right? And people say there's a hikmah behind this, behind Allah's plan behind this, because the Salaf are those we depend on to transmit hadith to us, right? So we want them to be the most honest generation. They have to be, otherwise to get it to us. But it didn't talk about their behavior per se, apart from their honesty in giving testimony in court cases. But it got made generalized, we have to follow the Salaf. No, we have to follow the Rasulullah and the ijma of Sahaba. That's what we follow, the Quran, the Rasulullah and the ijma of Sahaba. People say, some Muslims who try to attack Islamic orthodoxy, try to say, there's no ijma in ijma, and they kind of laugh and they pat themselves on the back of their little witty, pithy statement and say, well, actually, there's a minimum ijma, which is we take the ijma of the Sahaba. Everyone does, even the Shia, because Ali's in it. Right? Everyone takes ijma Sahaba. It's accepted basis for all of us. But anyway, all the ikhtilaf, and this is going to be controversial, but it's absolutely true. All the ikhtilaf you see Muslims debate with each other, and where they call each other deviant or heretic or what have you, or mubtadi', even though bid'ah is related to inventing new ibadah, right? Only those who say, I have a new ibadah to add that we should be following, that the Prophet Muhammad didn't tell us to do, that's bid'ah. That's what bid'ah refers to, by the way, not coming with a new interpretation per se. Otherwise, all ijtihad would be all new ijtihad would be bid'ah then, if that was the definition. So, all the ikhtilaf on what does it mean by Allah has a wajh or a yad? Yeah? This kind of discussion about what this means, for example, which is a big issue between the Ash'a'ira and the Maturidi and those who are Athari. If we see nothing in the hadith about this that gives us an explicit the teaching of it, or nothing in the Quran that gives us an explicit explanation for that, and we have nothing from the Ijma Sahaba, or even the Sahaba generally, that goes into deeper detail, then guess what? Everything outside of that then is a subject to opinion. But what the Sahaba are upon are the clear ijma that we can see from the Sahaba, and what the Prophet Muhammad said, which is in clear-cut mutawatir narrations, and what is clear-cut in the Quran, in the muhkam of the Quran. Those should be the limit or the minimum of where we say we go up to here, we say up to this limit is absolutely definite. Outside of this, have your opinions if you want, but please state that Allahu Alam. Simply. It's as simple as that. It's not that complicated. So, right, so 7 minutes, yeah? 2 minutes, okay. Khair, inshallah. So, if we're going to follow that hadith, please. If the Sahabas didn't go into detail, right? If they didn't say, if they didn't take any explicit, if they didn't repeat any of the explicit formula that you see in different schools of thought or books of Aqidah that come later, then don't go further than they did. It's as simple as that. And say certainty. But if you must go beyond and say, okay, I'm going to do ta'wil, or I'm going to take the zahir meaning of this or this, if you must do that, fine, but acknowledge simply that you don't know for certain. And Allahu Alam. It's a very simple formula, and it's controversial. Why is it controversial to say this? Because people in the different schools of thought of Aqidah, and in the furu of Aqidah, the branches of Aqidah, there's so much want to latch on to what makes them different, what makes them special, or what have you, that if it was simply a matter of, well, everyone has an opinion, it wouldn't make them special anymore. It has to be that everyone else are not just differing with them, but they are actually wrong, and wrong that we know for certain that you can condemn them publicly for it. Right? Makes them special. What does the Quran say about the people of the book? That they split up into different groups or sects, and each one was proud of what they had with them. Our special Aqidah makes us like we are the true Christians or the true Jews. Everyone else. And they'd give themselves special names as well. You know, we are the people of the Bible. We're the people of the gospel. We're the people of Mary or whatever. Each one like picking something that is special, a special name, and then they give it to themselves and say, this makes us special. That's why it's controversial, because people say, but the scholars, this particular scholar condemned this scholar for this opinion. Well, yeah, that might be true, but throughout Muslim history, unfortunately, these scholars takfir each other, and there are many reputable scholars, classical scholars, all disagreeing with each other and condemning each other with very strong words. Which scholar do we follow? Yeah, which condemnation is the one that we must all adopt? I simply say, look, just follow that hadith. Don't go beyond what the Sahaba did and said, and leave it like, and then just say Allahu Alam for afterwards. If you want to say I have an opinion about something, fine. If you are a scholar, of course. Have an opinion or follow the opinion of a scholar, but simply say Allahu Alam. Like, I think that the ta'wil or this tafsir of this particular verse of Quran is very compelling to me by this scholar, but Allah knows best. Okay, let's break for Isha, and then we'll reconvene and discuss the other matters. Okay, Bismillah. Taqabbal Allah, everyone. And inshallah, let's begin in earnest. Okay, so so we just finished up talking about who's the saved sect. The saved sect is the Jama'ah, right? And the Jama'ah isn't just the group that calls himself Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, but the Jama'ah is actually all the Muslims united. The Muslims united under one. The Jama'ah, according to, there's a narration there's a narration where there was a Sahabi who asked Rasulullah sallallahu about, some people asked him about the good in the future, and he asked about, the bad and what would happen in the future, and about the bad times. And he got to the point where all these calamities would be happening. The Prophet Muhammad was telling him about these calamities, about what would happen in the Muslim Ummah, and he asked what to do when these calamities occur. So the Rasulullah said, stick to the Jama'ah and their Imam. Right? Stick to the Jama'ah and their Imam. So it was clearly understood that the Jama'ah is the political body of the Ummah, the united political body of the Ummah, and their Imam. Right? Not the Imams, not the scholars, but the one Imam. Right? Hence, it's the leader. And then of course the Sahabi was very astute, and so he said, what if there is no Jama'ah and no Imam? Right? Then the Rasulullah ﷺ said, then separate from the firq, even if you have to eat the roots of trees. The different factions, even you have to eat the roots of trees. Now, some people have tried to take a theological interpretation, saying this refers to the different sects. But in this particular case, no, because it's the one Imam and the Jama'ah. So if there's no Imam and Jama'ah, it doesn't say, okay, and well then follow the saved sect. Right? It refers to, actually, I would say Allahu Alam, but it refers to very much our situation today. There's no Imam of the Muslims. What the Jama'ah of the Muslims has been separated out now, so that now the one Jama'ah arguably no longer exists, because it's been destroyed and separated out into bits. And so what to do? Well, if you're going to follow this hadith, then you don't follow your local, the local amir of your local firq, right? No. But you have to live somewhere, you have to be somewhere. And the local firq would refer to the different states and governments that have emerged since the fall of the Muslim Khilafah. Right? Since the fall of the Khilafah, you have all these different states. These are the firaq. Right? So, what does it mean you have to leave all these countries? Well, no. It simply means that you cannot follow or view them as your Jama'ah, right? As your group, as your people, until the Jama'ah is reconstituted, until we have an Imam back over us. Now, unfortunately, there was one scholar who used this hadith, and he said, when people asked, is establishing the Khilafah, like re-establishing it, re-establishing the political role that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ left for us, and then it was taken up by Abu Bakr, and then Umar, and Uthman, and Ali anhum. Is it obligatory? So he used this hadith, unfortunately, this particular scholar used this hadith, a recent scholar, not the classical scholars. The classical scholars would say, like Imam Ghazali and others, he would say that without the Khalifa who appoints the judges and gives the judges their authority, he said that your marriages might not even be valid. Right? Imam Ghazali said that. And all the wala, all the amirs, even the local amirs of different countries or different governorates of the Khalifa are no longer valid. Right? So Imam Ghazali said that. But so the classical scholars would said the Khilafah is fundamental to fulfilling the verse of the Quran that said, do not be divided amongst yourselves. Right? And obey those who are uli amr minkum, those in authority, those who've been raised to authority amongst you. Yeah. The classical scholars, there's an ijma on the issue of Khilafah. So much so that the first splits in the Muslim community was simply on who is the Khalif, who should be the Khalif. Right? The Khawarij went one way. They said Khalif has to not commit any serious sins at all, and they viewed Ali radhiyallahu anhu as committing sins. In terms of they gave that false accusation against him, but in their head, his simple being pragmatic in a political way with Muawiyah was a sin to them. And then the Shia was that they thought, the Khalifa must be from the Prophet's family and a specific designated person from the Prophet's family, or 12, or 7, or 5, depending on which particular madhab of the Shia you're following. So these early splits were on the issue of Khilafah, on who should be a Khalifa, because it was so central. Right? It was so central. And if the Khawarij, when they split from the Jama'ah, they did bara' from the Muslim, from the Jama'ah, and they went separate from the Imam. Right? They did takfir, they on the rest of the Muslims and on the Khalifa, and they went separate, and they made their own mini imam in their own area, their own separate imam in their own area, right? So these hadiths wanted to be political, but there's a particular recent scholar, I'm not going to name him, who used this hadith to say Khilafah is not fard. He said if the Khilafah was an obligation, then if there's no imam, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would have commanded you to re-establish the imam. But he didn't. But this scholar, in giving us his explanation of how he come to that conclusion, allowed us to see the error he made, which is there be a future time where if there could be a future time where there's no imam, it would also include, in that question by the Sahabi, he said, what if there's no imam and no jama'ah? There's no jama'ah. The Muslim jama'ah is gone. It's like been dispersed. It's like separated out, right? So you can't have unity when the jama'ah is split out. Right? The jama'ah has to be reunited again or recreated again before you can have your the imam. So the Muslims understood these verses and things or these narrations in political sense. Right? Today, Muslims read the hadith sometimes in the Quran in a secular sense. But Muslims back then, to be split, to split from the imam, to have sometimes a different madhab was to mean a significant one. It would mean you'd reject the Khalifa himself and you'd split out. And even then, not always the case. For example, the Twelvers, I suppose the majority faction Shia, their concept, one of their leading scholars said that in the time of the hidden imam, when the imam, they believe in a hidden imam that goes into ghaiba, for example, and while he's hidden, you can work with the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, you can work with the Sunni Caliph, and work under his institutions and work with them until the Mahdi comes, until the Mahdi reveals himself, and then he'll become the real Caliph, right? So even then, they found a way to actually justify working with Sunnis in a Sunni Caliphate and so on. Most people didn't realize that the Buyids, as they were called, right? The Buyid dynasty, where they controlled the Abbasid Caliphate, the Buyids were Shia, and they kept the Sunni Caliph. They were like they took over, but they kept the Sunni Caliph as a figurehead, and they fought against the Fatimids, which were Ismailis, right? So you had this very surreal situation where the Sunni Caliph is being, although was kind of a prisoner, but also a figurehead, was kept, because the Shia Buyids know that they're Shia, and of course Sunnis are not going to accept them as a leader, and so they were kept and propped up the Abbasid Caliphate until the Seljuks took over and took over them. But there was one point where the Shias were propping up the Sunni Caliphate, right? You think, what? That's a bit weird. How is that possible? But see, history is not like what you imagine it to be, basically. Anyway, the point is that unity of the Muslims can be practically achieved. We'll discuss that, but it can only be practically and politically achieved by the resumption of a re-establishment of a Khilafah, which is deemed to be fard by ijma' of all the classical scholars. There were only two people that differed, or two groups that differed. Rather, there was a Mu'tazilite scholar called, he was nicknamed Al-Assam. His name was Ibn Kaysan, but he was nicknamed by everyone else as Al-Assam, which was a bit of a rude epithet. It's saying he's blind because he disagreed. But Ibn Kaysan, he said that the Khilafah is only obligatory if Muslims can't live under an Islamic anarchy, right? So in Islamic anarchy, the Sharia is implemented by every individual. Everyone becomes a vigilante and does it themselves. But that's not possible. If it's impossible to do that, then Khilafah is obligatory, right? And then there was a particular subsect of the Khawarij, a particular subsect, a separate faction called the Najdiyah, and they believed that anyone can implement the Sharia just by yourself. You just do it, go out and punish people by yourself, like become a vigilante, it's all good. They believed that you didn't need to have any kind of leadership at all whatsoever, like no government. They were anarchists, basically. And it's not because they believe that you have different forms of government is possible. No. They just believe that government wasn't required, full stop. Right? They were anarchists. Those were the only people that disagreed. Every other school of thought, all classical scholars, there was ijma on the on the obligation of khilafah. And now you mention it today, sounds strange. Sounds, isn't it optional, right? Or in an ideal situation, I wonder what they'd say to Imam Ghazali, who would have said, well, your marriage contracts might be invalid. He didn't say might be, he said they are. Because the judges that presided over your marriage contracts don't have any authority. It's just like you got some random Joe from the street and said, come preside over my marriage, or any court case you do. What gives someone, let's say in Canadian law system, what gives someone the rank of judge and someone who just knows a lot about the law? What's the difference between someone who knows quite a lot about the law, right? Maybe very well educated, got PhDs in Canadian law, and someone who's a judge in a Canadian law court? What's the difference? Can anyone tell me? One is appointed by the authority, like validated. Yeah. One is appointed by the authority and now has authority itself, and the other one doesn't have authority. That's how Imam Ghazali viewed it. That all the ulama today who preside over cases have no authority, and anyone who calls themselves an emir is fake. It's not amir. No. Anyway, so to conclude, unity is not based on everyone agreeing. That's impossible. That's never going to happen. The Sahabas can't do it. You can't do it. But unity is simply the mindset that you say, your problems are my problems. Your war is my war, your peace is my peace. In the Muslims' war is one, the Muslims' peace is one, the Muslims' interests and affairs are one. And then we have a system, a political system, a jurisdiction that extends over the Muslims with one imam as the leader, ultimately. Yeah, you can have majalis, and you can have administrators, all this stuff. Obviously not going to be one guy doing everything, obviously, but you have to have one. In every political system, there's always one executor of that system, whether it's a prime president or a prime minister or a king. There's always one person at the top that has to be the one that says, let's make the decision this way or that way, right? The hakim that does hukum, that does judgment, right, as that word comes from. So that's how we can make practical unity. But it also helps not to takfir each other on issues that are not takfirable, and not to call each other deviant or heretic on issues where only Allah truly knows the reality of the matter. And He will explain to us on the Day of Judgment what we argued on, what we differed on. Yeah. But do you want to go on the Day of Judgment having to explain to Allah that you gave certainty to something that was done, that was only speculative, or that you didn't know for certain, and you assumed certainty, even though the Quran says that doubt or speculative things does not avail the truth, right? Or do you want to say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I had an opinion, I said that you know best, because I knew that I could be wrong, but I thought this was stronger in my opinion. That would be factually correct. Yeah, you did think something was stronger in your opinion, you adopted it, and you knew it could be wrong. You can't be faulted for that. So, okay. Next slide. Nationalism. The belief, people think that nationalism is simply, there's a big misconception of nationalism. People think nationalism is either someone just being proud of their ethnic group, or loving their ethnic group, or just loving the language, their own language, or their own food, or what have you. And it means any kind of tribalism. No, nationalism is not the same as the word asabiyya, but asabiyya encompasses nationalism. Asabiyya means in Arabic grouping, right? You have a group, you have group favoritism, or you want to group together. Nationalism is the simple idea that your ethnicity or language, and people that share your ethnicity and language, usually one and the same thing, ethno-linguistic group, have a better right to make the laws and rules in a particular geographical location than anybody else. Right? That's what it actually is. That's what it actually means. Right? When people say, we want self-determination for, I don't know, Balochis. What they're saying is that they don't want people who are not Balochi to make laws and rules in the area called Balochistan. So anyone who's not of the Balochi ethnic group, let's say, to give an example, it's in Pakistan basically, should not make the rules and laws in a geographical location known as Balochistan. What we'd say to that, or what we say to anyone else who says, France should represent the interests of the French people, England should represent the interests of the English people, the Anglo-Saxons or whatever, what we'd say to that is, that's actually racism, right? You're saying that your ethno-linguistic group gives you a privilege to make rules and laws in a geographical location that no other race, what we mean by race, we just mean ethnicity, can do that. That's what it actually means. But people don't realize that when they say it. They don't realize it when they make the argument. Nationalism is a brand new phenomenon, by the way. It never existed in ancient history or medieval history. Just because people spoke the same language in the past, they never saw any reason to unite together just on that basis. They fought each other most likely because you fight your neighbors more than you fight those who are not your neighbors. So in the ancient world, people fought each other of the same ethnicity. They didn't care about ethnicity. That was developed by the West in the 19th century. And then in colonialism, they thought, we conquered the world and we've taken their resources. What do we do after it costs too much for us to keep our troops there? Let's find a better way. Let's tell them to rule themselves, but we have pre-existing contracts they have to honor. And we just keep taking their resources at dirt cheap prices without having to leave our soldiers there. Perfect. We make them think they're ruling themselves. Excellent. That's like a better deal than having to occupy their country. So how do we do it? Well, let's just, where we can, they'll say we'll draw a line around a particular ethnic group and say that's a country. Where they couldn't or where they think it's not that feasible, they just drew a line around the area that they control. England did it in Nigeria and in India or India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, where it was today. Of course, they found disputes from the people because they helped to create dissension. They ruled by dissension in India, by the way. And then these artificial states were created, which are not even based on ethnicity. Like India, saying India it should be one country because they're one people is like me saying Asia should be one country because they're one people. They're all Asians, aren't they? They speak different languages. They're really different from each other. It just shows you how racist the British were. They all look the same to us. Oh, you probably want people then. That's probably, even though they're radically different. Some of the languages are radically different from each other. Ironically, Hindi is more closer to English than it is to Tamil because it's Indo-European language. Anyway, so unsurprisingly, nationalism is linked to racism because there's always a question as to the state represents the nation. Okay, which nation? Right? Canada is a great example. You've got English speakers, you've got French speakers. The French speakers don't want to be ruled by the English speakers, and English speakers have tensions with the French speakers. I met one random Trump supporter in Canada one day on a plane one day, and he told me, I was just curious, I was listening to him why do you believe these things and whatever. And despite his, let's say, xenophobia that he had, he told me this. He said, English speakers in Canada actually have less problem with immigrants than they do with the French speakers in Canada. Although technically they're all immigrants, but anyway. So what's the cause of that? It's nationalism, right? And it's the cause of the wars. It's the cause of why Ukraine is there's a war with Ukraine. Russia claimed that there were Russian speakers in Ukraine that were being discriminated against by the Ukrainian parliament, which wanted to pass a law that would not recognize Russian as a minority language anymore. It would just no longer recognize it. There was claims that the fascist Ukrainians were coming into power after a mini revolution in Ukraine, and so Russia used that as a pretext to arm its Russian supporters or just send its own army and pretend they're Ukrainian Russian speakers and to control the parts of Ukraine. But all that comes from the argument of the Russian speakers versus the Ukrainian speakers because of nationalism. And they say that, there's parts of Ukraine, because they have Russian speakers, they should have given independence to represent a state that represents their ethnicity or ethno-linguistic group. Okay, so that's where nationalism comes from. In the ancient world, they had asabiya. It wasn't nationalism, it was tribalism usually. or cityism, right? They didn't care about that nation, but they cared about tribe. And they would fight each other for those reasons. They say, my tribe over your tribe. There was a little saying amongst the Quraysh, you're either the oppressed or the oppressor, so better to be the oppressor. Right? And that pretty much is the basis behind most wars. And unfortunately, amongst Muslims, that is the basis behind, unfortunately, that has been inculcated into us, where now you don't view yourselves as Muslim anymore, but you view yourself as, oh, I'm an Arab. I'm not even just an Arab anymore. I'm an Egyptian Arab. I'm not even a Shami Arab anymore. Sham was like a whole area. No. I'm a Palestinian Arab. I'm a Lebanese Arab. I'm a Syrian Arab. Turks are now different kinds of Turks and Turks of Turkey. That they view themselves as Turkish primarily. Many of them. Iranians view themselves as Persian first. In many cases, and what comes in Persian interest is more important. And in some countries which are actually a conglomerate of ethnic groups, there are ethnic tensions now. People in, again, Pakistan, many of the complaints of the Balochis, they say, oh, Pakistan favors the Punjabis over everybody else. You know, and so why do we have to listen to them? Why can't we get independence? And of course, India's encouraging that. But also India has its own issues too, with Tamils in the south want to get rid of these Aryan invaders from their land, or at least have their own independence. And they have a number of their own, it's multiple states, multiple ethnic groups, so they have also issues. And Myanmar or Burma, where the Rohingyas are being persecuted because of nationalism, or these are ethnic Bengalis, they're not part of us. There are actually a number of other ethnic groups in Burma which are having independence movements and fighting. There's about 3 different civil wars happening in Burma at the same time. All this in the era of nationalism. And what does the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam say to Muslims regarding this? Oh, yeah, no, that's fine. Relax, brother, relax. Go 2 slides, please. One slide back. Yeah, that's it. Very simple. It's a very strong condemnation. If you want something to condemn, then condemn those who cause the Asabiyya. The Rasulullah has reported to said, he is not one of us, not one of the Muslims, who calls to, now the English here is tribalism, but the word is Asabiyya, which is generic, means any grouping, not out of the Ummah. Who calls to Asabiyya, he is not one of us who fights for the sake of Asabiyya, he is not one of us who dies following the way of Asabiyya. There's other verses that condemn it even worse, that anyone who takes, I think to paraphrase, anyone who takes pride in their lineage, or they assert their lineage is like biting the intimate part of their father. Use language to show you how disgusting it is and how ridiculous it is, right? And yet Muslims follow it today. So, Bengalis have issues with Pakistanis have issues with Bengalis, Persians have issues with Turks have issues with Persians. Arabs have a ranking system amongst themselves and issues with each other. And in North Africa, Amzigh, or what they call Berbers, and Arab tension there. Every place you want to point to, I can give you an example of mutual hatred and kibr as well, not just asabiyya, but kibr, where people take pride in their own ethnic group, even though we know that from a narration, anyone who has even a mustard seed weight of pride in their heart will enter Jannah. Right? So do you really want to be proud of things that you never chose, as you mentioned as well, that you come to that conclusion, like you was telling me in the car, that why are we so proud about things we never chose? Yeah, things I've said many times. Why you didn't choose it, so why are you proud of it? Right? Why don't you try to take pride in your piety to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you're in fear of Him? And even then, we depend on Allah to guide us, ultimately. Right? So don't take pride in that. And what does Islam do? How does Islam deal with nationalism? It gives a response, right? A concept of Bani Adam, which is that all human beings are part of the same tribe. If you want a tribe to follow, well, that's the tribe, is we're all Bani Adam, we're all cousins, biologically, and of course, Islam was stating that at a time when people wouldn't know for certain if all humans are actually related or even human, right? But now genetics have shown that, yeah, we are all cousins, basically. And specifically amongst Muslims, fellow believers, we are part of the ummah, right? We are immediate family to each other. So non-Muslims are like cousins to us, you could say, and all of us are like close-knit family. Brothers, basically, brothers and sisters. And so Islam deals with that concept. And as Muslims, we should, when people say we have to talk about all the things that might lead people into Jahannam, it's very important, and they leave the political stuff aside. But if Muslims have kibr, or they call to asabiyya, and they are now no longer part of the Muslims, if you want to take this hadith literally, isn't that quite significant? Right? There's other narrations that say they are actually on the way of Jahiliyyah, they're living back in Jahiliyyah, but like before Islam came, by calling to these ideas and these things. Isn't that quite important? Sorry? All right, so these are things that we need to focus on. Now I think because I kind of covered a lot of this, I'm going to be covering this stuff, these lectures, I'm saying these things at different universities, and because I was told that it would be mostly a Muslim audience, I kind of tailored this lecture, I kind of put more time into the areas of this lecture that I think was very important for Muslims, which is the issue of sectarianism and nationalism. But if I maybe permit just 2 minutes, next slide on liberalism, we'll kind of just leave it there. Long story short, liberalism is the belief that people are the owners of themselves. You own yourself. If you believe that as a concept, then you're going to find any religion to be oppressive. Or any religion that argues that there's a creator, you're going to find it to be intrinsically oppressive. Because as Muslims, we believe that Allah owns all of us and everything in the universe. So if you believe that you are the owner of yourself, then the implications are that what is good and bad is only determined by whether you respect other people's property rights to themselves, and your property rights of your body is respected. That's how they judge good and bad. So then they say, oh, good, then why is God interfering in my life? Why do liberals say that? Why would they say that? Or why does God punish you in hell for things which are not rape or murder, let's say? Because rape and murder, they can say, oh, we understand that. That's like against other people's property right in themselves. You're disrespecting their property rights of their body. But why should they punished for shirk? Yeah, shirk doesn't harm anybody. Right? If they say this argument, it's because they have that belief. They'll say that any political system that doesn't honor people's right to do with their body as they see fit is oppressive. Why do they say that? Because they have this belief. And of course, the moral implications are that they'll say that good and bad is purely defined by by the consent of the individual to things, and that's it. So if you don't deal with this concept by simply telling people, why did you say you own yourself? Did you make yourself? Did you make yourself? What part of this universe gives you the right, your ownership rights to yourself? Where did you get your ownership rights? In ancient cultures, people thought that your parents owned you, right? Because they made you, right? How do you own yourself? The universe, if you're just materialistic, the universe doesn't care about your property right in yourself. If you go safari in Africa and a lion sees you, it's not going to ask your consent to eat you. It's just going to rip your legs off and whatever, right? Yeah, it doesn't care. Right? So nature doesn't care about your property rights to your body. So where do you get the idea from? Yeah. So refute it. Don't accept that as a premise. Could you go two slides forward, please, brother? Again, we're going rapid fire here. Right, feminism. Feminism simply they argue that it just means women should have equal rights to men. What they mean is that it's because liberalism was given first to men, and then in the West, and then it was argued that women should enjoy the same liberal rights as men when they were denied the prior. So in England, women didn't have property rights when they got married. The husband owned their property. Right? We didn't have this problem in Islam, right? This is like not our situation. But that's why it became so traumatic on their own psyche in Europe, and they just project it onto everyone else in the world. Oh, you had the same problem we did. Say, no, that's just you. It's your history, not us. Like, don't include us in your neurosis. Yeah. But the issue, of course, is that where it does, let's say, where it does transgress against Islamic norms and modes is the idea of mixing the idea of equality to identicality. Okay? So in Islam, we believe that men and women are of equal value to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then everyone differentiates as individuals based on your taqwa, right? You know, so that we say that a person who's a criminal, is a sinner, a mujrim, is going to be less in Allah's eyes than someone who has taqwa, right? Male, female, doesn't matter, right? There's many verses in the Quran that say this, like the men and women, the one is as the other, and so on and so forth. But here's the issue. Feminism views gender differentiation in roles, different gender roles in a family, for example, as well as any difference, to be unjustifiable, because men and women are meant to be equal, i.e. identical. Whereas for us, we say men and women are equal in value in Allah's eyes, but are not identical physically in terms of tendencies, but are not identical in specific gender roles. So let's say, men are obliged to provide for the family. Women are not obliged to provide for the family, even if the woman's more rich than the guy, but the gender roles remain that way. Or if there's a war, then the men go out to fight in the war. Women are not obliged, although there were cases where there were women who went voluntarily to join the army of the Prophet Muhammad and they were allowed, but it's not obligated on them to, or expected of them to fight in the army. So there's gender roles, big surprise. But why? Well, gender dimorphism in any species indicates that indicates to us that species has a slightly different role for the males and the females in that species. Yeah? Or even in species that don't have that much gender difference, like rabbits. Male rabbit, female rabbit looks the same, but the male rabbit actually has different tendencies to the female rabbit. In terms of the female rabbits tend to be more, they guard their home more and they're more broody, and male rabbits are more like they clash externally outside of the burrow. With other rabbits they defend their territory in other ways. They have differences even though in behavior, even though they don't actually look different. But we do look different. It's called testosterone. It's why you're physically different than women, for example, referring to the guys. And that has issues. It's nature steroids, basically. It makes you taller, bigger, with heightened muscle mass. It's why they have to segregate the Olympics and all the games. Oh, why not equality in sports? Yeah, equality, right? Okay, everyone go to males, females in sports. Why the gender segregation? Yeah, right. Why? Well, because nature doesn't really care about your equality or identicality, right? So you have to challenge that, right? Why do you say men and women are identical? Okay? Equal in value, we accept. But why are you saying they're identical? They're not. Clearly they're not. Okay? So we have to discuss that. Why is that the case? And of course, they'll come up with silly reasons. They'll say that the difference is not due to testosterone or hormones. No. It's due to social acculturation, due to toxic masculinity. Men are told to be more aggressive and competitive. Hormones, that's just a myth or something like that. They actually argue that because the scientists tell them, but clearly hormones has effect. If hormones have an effect on animals like rabbits and what have you, then clearly it's going to have an effect on us. Yeah, testosterone or what have you, right? Why are we different from the animal kingdom in terms of how hormones affect us? No, but humans are different. No, in terms of hormones do basic chemical things like they do in any other species. And again, the theological implications are, I've known of cases where people who became feminist or adopted feminism, they reopened the Quran, determined it was patriarchal, they said it's biased towards men, and they then rejected Islam. And they say, why do men have more power in certain situations, what have you? They attribute power to be privilege, whereas what we'd say is no, it's responsibility, because men have more than responsibilities in terms of having to provide and put their life on the line. You have to defend your family with your life, by the way, as well as provide your wealth. No one's going to tell a woman, why aren't you spending money on your family, on your husband? It's not obliged. She doesn't have to. Even if she's rich and he's like dirt poor, it's not her obligation. Is that female privilege? Right? Yeah. So that's. But that the worst thing about feminism is it creates gender asabiyya, right? Sectarianism. It now says it's men versus women, when really we are all servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we will have mutual rights and duties. That's how the Islamic lens. But the feminist lens will replace that with men versus women, and they'll look at all the bad cases, and there are bad cases of domestic abuse. These things, the crimes do occur. The issue is, how do we understand it? Do we say, well, look, there's criminality, there's jahiliyyah in the Muslim community at the moment, there's a whole number of issues. We want everyone to be happy, we want husbands to be happy, we want wives to be happy, we want good, positive homes and families for everyone, where people are fulfilled, every Muslim to be fulfilled, inshallah. That's what we want, right? But the feminists will say, why aren't women being fulfilled, or why aren't they happy? Say, well, why isn't everyone happy? Let's deal with it as a collectively, and also balance family duties so that everyone is happy and so on. Usually one person's misery is linked to another person's misery. There's symbiotic relationship between in marriage, and you have to deal with both sides, right? And that doesn't mean you ignore the crimes. You don't ignore. Yeah, domestic violence is mostly committed by men. In terms of numbers, true. But guess what? There's a statistic that shows, proportionally speaking, more domestic violence occurs, proportionally speaking, between females in lesbian relationships. I was actually quite shocked by the statistic. Is that due to toxic masculinity? Yeah. Anyway, and last but not least, next slide. We'll just leave it, end it there. So go all the way to the end except one. Actually, back to. Oh, I just died. I just gave up. Okay, go back. What was it? 1, 2. Yeah, just go back to. One more. Yeah, there. That one. Click on it. Yeah. Okay, lastly but not least, post-Marxism, woke activism. This is simply an ideology that emerged from Marxist thought and then developed over time to neo-Marxism, then post-Marxism. It's attached to what you might call postmodernism as well. It basically views that there is no real truth in the world anymore. All truth is just interpretation, and all interpretation is based on power. Based on the will to power. So all people's ideas and beliefs in this world, especially political ones, are simply based on the desire for power for one group or one person. That's why people say we all have different truth. You have your truth, I've got my truth. And what they argue is that everyone's truth is equal, because it does not matter what you believe, because the argument is that the universe is infinitely interpretable. There's infinite interpretations about this world. So it's irrelevant which interpretation is being argued or believed in. What is relevant is that every individual their own interpretation is given equal weight to anybody else's. And then they look towards if there's any preference based on any identity group has too much weight in its interpretations of reality or its beliefs. So they'll look at class, they'll look at race, they'll look at gender, they'll look at sexual identity or taste or what have you and call that an identity. They'll look at even disability as well and ableism. They'll have all these different ways to, these different lenses. And they say we want to make it equal across every single category and lens that we can look at. And for them, many Muslims work with these kind of activists because they promise Muslims, they say, we don't like how the right wing attack you Muslims. We support your right as Muslims to identify as Muslims. But there's a cost with that, which is if you actually start explaining Islam and what you believe, they will reject you, say, oh, what you believe is barbaric, it's wrong, it's against equality. But what they want is they want you to have the right to identify yourself as Muslim, just as long as there's no content behind that identity. They want you to be Muslim, but they're okay with you being Muslim by label, but as long as there's no content behind that label. Because that content will contradict. Because we don't believe truth is relative. We believe in al-haq, the truth. There's only one truth behind reality. And the idea that all the people are going to Jahannam because they reject it, when they believe that everyone's truth is equal, do you think that's going to be compatible? Going to see Islam as compatible with their worldview? No, they're not. The political implications of this is going to be that Muslims, it affects actually a lot of political activism by Muslims themselves, as Muslims then use the arguments of woke activism or post-Marxism to make arguments. They say we're for decolonialism, okay? Because Muslims think, decolonialism, we hate colonialism, look what it did to us. But what they mean by that is that it's wrong to have one civilization impose or spread its values onto another civilization, or to spread it beyond its borders or to go to other peoples. Guess what? They would indict Muslim history. Right? When the caliphates conquered the Romans and the Persians, that's what they would call colonialism. They'd use it against us. They'd also say to have one group's culture to be given any kind of privilege over any other is also unjust. So they would say that Islam is Arab supremacy. Because why must Arabic be the best language, or the language that you have to learn, or the language that's part of your religion, or whatever? Yeah, why that has to be the central language for your religious expression? Yeah. You say, well, the Quran is, I can't understand the Quran or Hadith without learning Arabic in terms of to actually have direct access to its deeper meanings. And they'll say, well, then that's just favoring Arab culture over other people's cultures. And some nationalists have used this in Muslim countries. Even in Muslim countries, they say that, in Malaysia, don't spread your Arab supremacy here. Yeah, even though they would call themselves Muslim, what have you, right? It's ridiculous. I was like, what? Are you even Muslim even to say that ridiculous argument? They'll say, and in India they use it. Yeah, they say that these Muslims are not following their traditional culture of their ancestors. They're following the imported colonializing culture. Right? So the thing about woke activism is you use it to try to defend Muslim rights by saying that Muslims should have the right, should be treated fairly, even if they identify as Muslim, but it can be used against Islam just as easily, if not more easily. Usually so. And if you think, well, decolonialism, don't we want to get rid of colonialism, its forms? Well, they mean all kinds of, they don't just mean power and control, they mean culture and everything. So I'll give you an example of how we know that the Prophet Muhammad how we know that he probably wouldn't have agreed with that, is because the Arabic word, which is also contained in the Quran, so the word dinar, right, which means a gold coin, yeah? It's not originally an Arabic word. There's no triliteral root for it, which show it's not a originally Semitic language word or Arabic word. It comes from, anyone know? Dinar? Yeah? Yeah, dinar. Yeah, dinar, it's like a coin. Like, okay, you have dirham and then you have dinars. Dirham is silver. It comes from the Romans. The denarius. They use a coin called a denarius. Yeah. Why did not the Prophet Muhammad said, this is Roman culture, get rid of it. Like, get rid of it. It's this in the Quran. Yeah. Oh, it's a Roman word. It wasn't originally Arabic, but it became Arabic language. It became part of the Arabic language. We have to decolonize Arabic. That's not something that the Prophet Muhammad cared about, but these woke activists would. That's why their priorities are just out of sync with us completely. So, and of course, they would also denounce Islam as being sexist and patriarchal, much like the feminists as well, but you can be a feminist and a woke activist at the same time, because feminism just means, for want of a better way of explaining it, and equality with women in any particular political ideology you follow from the West. So whether you're a Marxist, you could be a Marxist feminist, you can be a liberal feminist. Radical feminism is a little bit different. It ranges from a number of views to even female supremacy, so a matriarchy, right? But none of these things have anything to do with Islam. Last slide but one, so the penultimate slide, please. We'll end it there. Okay. The Islamic solution to these things, very simply, is we assert there's only one source of truth, al-Haq, the creator of reality itself. People ask, what's the basis for good and bad? We say, His word. And they'll say, isn't that arbitrary? Well, if He made the universe by His word, why is it so hard to accept that good and bad is also by His word too? Yeah, good and bad is what He commands us to do. That's our definition of good and bad. Right? Good and bad is what is given to created beings to do. That's how we understand it. It's whether we you fulfill your purpose, it's good. You don't, it's bad. Right? Allah doesn't have a purpose because He wasn't created. Simple. Rival ideologies like feminism, liberalism, post-Marxism, you have to make them justify their principles first. Like, tell us from first principles why we must believe your way, your worldview, your belief. You need to justify it to us. Yeah, we don't have to justify Islam to you in terms of from your basis. No, you have to justify yourself first. And we have a reason why we believe that Islam is true. We can argue that and we can call you to it, that's great. But you need to justify yourself to us. We have to be unapologetic about Islam, argue its laws confidently, but with hikmah as well. Don't just simply say things like, yeah, of course we should do this, 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 and this. No, understand what does Islamic law actually say, and then explain it with hikmah. And by hikmah, you don't have to explain it in liberal terms. Just simply show that, look, what do you think addresses human nature better? Human fitrah. This Islamic law or your so-called Western laws? Yeah. So when someone commits a crime, you just put them in a big cage and keep them away from their family. And they even become worse criminals when they leave it. And it doesn't really work because the highest prison population in the world, does anyone know where it is, the highest prison population in the world? Yep, United States of America. So it's not really working, is it? Yeah, that's the country which is more closer to individual liberty than any other of the countries. Yeah, whereas Islam, we have more efficacious approaches, which are meant to basically actually return back people who obviously are not facing capital punishment back to their family the very same day. They're not kept in cages or separate from their families. Why are you punishing families for? What have I argued? I haven't argued from a liberal basis. I've simply argued that doesn't it make better for the fitrah? Does it make better to achieve the solution of reducing crime? You stop someone's ability to steal, for example. You hamper it. And what do you steal with? It's not your nose, is it? All right. Or your ears. What do you steal with? Yeah. Right. And again, and it's not poor people that are punished. If you steal because you're starving or you're hungry, you're not punished in Islam. Whereas if you steal because you're hungry, even in the West, okay, you won't get like a 10-year prison sentence, but they'll still punish you. They don't care you're poor. In Islam, you don't get punished. It's actually fault of the state, fault for not providing for you. Yeah? Argue it like this, is with hikmah. Which one agrees better with human nature? Well, the one who gave the law that comes from the creator of human nature, that law would agree best with human nature. Simple. Fulfill the fitrah. Argue with hikmah. Don't adopt the liberal paradigm, because then you surrender the base of good and bad to them, and you say, okay, your basis of good and bad is the better one, and I'm going to have to show how Islam fits your basis. No, you prove your basis, and I've got some critiques for your basis too, right? That's how you should approach it. And lastly, Muslims must make actual practical efforts to unite. Don't just give lip service to it, right? Like, tie your camel and then have hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So make dua for your Muslim unity and take efforts for Muslim unity. And the smallest thing you can do, even on a short-term basis, is forgive someone, a fellow Muslim that you think has aggrieved you and you feel you can't forgive them, right? Forgive them. Not just for that, but also because if you want Allah's forgiveness for your sins, which might be far worse, then at least forgive someone for sins which are far less. Yeah, because you're all fallible, right? And what does the Quran say? Right? Like pardon, overlook each other. Wouldn't you want Allah to forgive you your sins? Yeah. So that's how. So at least on a smaller scale, unite yourselves like that. Unite your hearts, but also look at the bigger picture too at the same time. Anyway, that's been the abridged and a modified version of my talk, because I was talking to the brothers when I came and they said that they were telling me of your particular needs, your particular realities, so I adapted my presentation and discussed more on issues like sectarianism, a bit more And then I discussed others because it's a Muslim audience, there's no non-Muslims here, so I discussed it like that. Anyway, I hope you found this useful and interesting, inshallah, and beneficial, but please don't just keep it as an interesting lecture. Take it into practice, otherwise it was pointless. And if you're serious, being serious about learning knowledge is aiming to implement it. Okay, so barakallahu feekum, and inshallah I'll take your questions on if we have any time.